Okay, everyone, as promised, here is 2.7, which is all about presidential communication. And this is how the president uses communication to communicate with both the branches of government and the public as a whole. And it's important to keep in mind that as communication technology has changed over time, um, the way they use those tools to set their agenda has changed over time. So we're going to think about things like the bully pulpit, right? That term we keep hearing a lot, spreading their message to the public, how the importance of messaging and setting that agenda, the importance of persuasion, and also of pressure. So we're going to look at the differences in some technology first. So, bully pulpit, we think of, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze here, Teddy Roosevelt, really making that. It's not like no other president communicated directly to the people, but never to the level that TR did. There are all different ways, and look at the history and how communication has evolved. So, originally, presidents could use things like the mail. And this is where franking privilege comes in. Because if you are an incumbent, if you are someone in office, you have the ability to use the mail to get that privilege and to get that message out. The way someone campaigning doesn't have the same access. They have to pay for all the stamps, so to speak. Then we have newspapers, presidents setting their message in newspapers. Then we have types of electronic broadcasts. Now, electronic, don't necessarily think like phones, but even things like telegrams, all right, that were sent. Here's a telegram from Woodrow Wilson back in the day. So you have cable technology and Morse code. Then you have radio transmissions. Then you have the use of telephone, then television, and then you get eventually the digital 24-hour, access that we have today. So, Teddy Roosevelt, he's the first one who really used the national newspapers. He developed a relationship with journalists to make sure that his message got published in articles, not just opinion pieces either. Hoover was the first president to then actually have a press secretary. And this is him here. This is George Ackerson, who was his press secretary from 1929 to 1931. We've already discussed FDR and his use of the radio in fireside chats. And then we also have Wilson. And Wilson was the first to use the State of the Union address as this powerful way to connect to the public, even though it's actually directly to Congress. Now, he is the first person to actually give that address in person since President John Adams, right? So the State of the Union address is this big hoopla, right? All the networks carry it. It gets lots of attention. But for a very long time, it was mostly just something between the president and Congress. Sometimes it was just a letter. It wasn't even in person. And maybe they would put it in the newspapers. But now it became something where the president was actually communicating with the people through that. In 1969, the White House had its first Office of Communications, and JFK became the first president to. Oh, this isn't working again today, and I don't like it. Became the first president to use televised news conferences. It was an attempt to control the message. You hear that term spin, right? To take any story and sort of put their angle on it. And there's a lot of clever things he could do with these televised news conferences. They could do things like put in fake reporters who would ask them easy questions that he already would anticipate those questions and have the answers prepared for them. A government was basically creating its own news broadcast when they would do this. And people would look at it as actual news. So there's some is there some manipulation there that should be concerned that still exists to this day? Then from President Eisenhower to Clinton, you can get a break into major networks with breaking news. So you just be watching your show, right? Remember, TV is much different than TV today. Like certain shows were at certain times. You couldn't just stream it whenever you wanted. And then all of a sudden the news would cut in with breaking news. And sometimes it would be the president who wanted a special message. And this would be then across all the channels. So whoever I had on TV, which would be most people at the time, this message would be coming across. And then you have CNN, which became the first 24 hours news network. And it's a little bit different than when we look at cable news networks today, where you sort of have like one for the left and the right, and then the far left and the far right. It was pretty much this one cable news network that people look to sort of regardless of their political ideology at the time. And this 24-hour news cycle greatly changed things. And we'll talk about that a lot when we talk about media and bias in future lessons. So, and how that bias affects the voting populace. So then we have President Obama, and this is not President Obama, but he started to use a large social media presence. There really was no such thing as social media for former presidents, and using video uploads to whitehouse.gov, for example. But Trump, who we have here, he really set a new standard with people using social media, specifically Twitter, as a primary means of communication. So if you wanted to know what he was up to or what message he wanted to get out, all you had to do was check Twitter at the time. And this is where you hear popular terms such as his calling things fake news, disparaging his political enemies through Twitter, praising loyalist or loyal advisors via Twitter, literally announcing policy that was unbeknownst to his staff at the time via Twitter. Sometimes people literally found out what is his opinions on things, his own staff, or are people hired and fired by Twitter. And this caused some confusion. Is this the executive policy? Is this his official word? Is this just something he's getting out on Twitter at the time? And another example of how he used the media was by, wait a few minutes, come back, was his use of interviews. He did more interviews than any previous president. And I have here his interview with Leslie Stahl, which a lot of famous lines that really shows his opinion of what he was trying to do at the time. And this interview, he actually called the News Corps enemies of the people and undermined the nature of free press, right? One of our early values going back to the revolution. So discrediting the source of information, any source other than himself. And you can see how that would affect the messaging and the populace and how they would interpret things. Other presidents would often do things like release press statements or releases, having press briefings, which we see regularly, or conferencing, or this is an example of a presidential address. This was one related to the COVID vaccine, I believe this image is from. So this is where the president would deliver a formal address. People knew that address was going to be on that night, and most of the networks would be covering that as well. So as we finish this up, it's important to remember that presidential agendas are important to the party's success, and voters reflect upon these agendas when they go to vote at elections. So let's finish this up with looking at Article 2, Section 3, Clause 1, and that mentions where the State of the Union comes out. You may recognize this is the second President Bush. That's his Vice President Cheney and Speaker of the House Pelosi, right? She was Speaker at that time as well. So in this State of the Union, the President presents their policy agenda. It's a proactive vision of the direction that they want the country to go in. But that depends on Congress. So they're also sort of asking Congress for what they want to get done and put some pressure on the people to set that agenda, which is really putting pressure on Congress because the people, like, hey, if the people want this too, you better get this done. And it comes from the Constitution where it says from time to time, Congress, they'll update Congress. Who decided that time to time means 1 year? Once again, that's just an example of a precedent. So you also see lots of traditions. And when the State of the Union comes up in a few months, we'll go over these. You'll see, when do people applause? When do they sit? It's usually one party sitting or standing, depending on the party of the president. Very rare where you get a moment, well, they're both standing and applauding. They literally count the time that people are applauding, the number of times. You'll see all this when we see that in a few months. And that is our video on presidential communication. I know it was mostly visuals, so hopefully you were able to pause and get the information out that you wanted to. And we'll discuss this because we're going to constantly see examples of this as we keep on top of the news and watch C-SPAN. All right, have a great day, guys.